Please give us a few minutes as we wait for others to join in. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question, and we'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over on Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live, and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our Facebook page to find them there. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Docent Halmerson, who will be presenting the history of still life painting continued the 17th century. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll turn things over to you, Docent Halmerson.
Thank you so much, Renata. Without Renata and Scott, these lectures would just not occur. Thank you for joining us. As Renata pointed out, we do like to take questions toward the end. I'll try to leave about 5 minutes, about 11:55 for any questions. And please feel free. The questions are really interesting. They stimulate great discussion. So always feel free to ask us. So we'll begin with the 17th century. 2 months ago, I did a history of still life painting, and that began really in the ancient times. I showed you frescoes from Roman times, Egyptian tombs had still life paintings. And even in the Middle Ages, there were aspects of still life painting in religious artwork. But still life, for still life's sake, really doesn't begin until the 17th century. Yes, in the Renaissance, I'm actually going to show you a Renaissance painting, or actually gouache, that does show that artists were beginning to experiment with still life painting. Now, the wonderful Hugo van der Goes, who was a Flemish Renaissance painter, did what was called the Portinari altarpiece. And I apologize, I don't have it to show you. But the reason why I bring it up is in this Adoration of the Shepherds, a very religious painting, there's a wonderful still life in the foreground, lying on the ground, a still life. And so we can see that artists were beginning to experiment and include still life in religious and non-religious painting. We're going to focus a lot on the area which is the Netherlandish region, which becomes, by the early part of the 17th century, a separate nation. And that was because of the Protestant Reformation. So, of course, Holland, what would be today Holland, is a Protestant nation. And what would be today Belgium is still going to be controlled by the Habsburgs in the 17th century. So it's a Catholic nation. Well, there was a ton of cross-pollination between Antwerpian artists and those in Amsterdam, The Hague, Delft, and that region. And Middelburg, too, was a great area in what is today Holland, where still life painters really evolved and took hold of the genre. You know, there was a hierarchy of painting that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it wasn't really until Caravaggio in the early part of the 17th century who really said, doing a still life requires a lot of skill. It shouldn't be lower on the hierarchical painting scale. It really does demand a lot of skill. So what countries are we going to talk about? This happens to be a painting by a German still life painter, George Flegel. We will talk about Dutch and Flemish, Italian, and Spanish. I apologize, I only have one French still life painter, that's Willem, and who really wasn't French by birth, but he spent a great deal of time in France, in Paris, creating still life. So I do apologize for the Francophiles. I did not include other French painters. I think of just with brevity and the limited time we have to discuss it. So we will discuss some aspects of French painting a little bit later. Now, the Dutch realized that there were symbolic aspects of objects what do I mean by that? Well, when you think about a skull or a candle or a stopwatch or a watch, it relates to the passing of time. And we call those memento mori, a momentum of that death will occur. And they were put in paintings called vanitas. And vanitas paintings, I will point out to you as soon as we get to the work of Pieter Claesz, for example. We have different kinds of still life painting. We have just regular stilleven, which is the word still life comes from, that's Dutch. And we have stilleven. This would be considered more of a stilleven because it's an ostentatious view of objects, very ornate. Now, in Spain and Italy, there was sort of a different trend. Spain was more about nature suspended. And in Italy, in Italy, we had nature suspended, and in Spain, we have the bodegas, which were more vegetal objects. And so there was a slight variation. The other thing I want to talk about really quickly, and you'll see it, is the use of light. Light becomes very important in still life painting, particularly when we look at the work of Caravaggio, for example. He was the master of chiaroscuro, highlighting light and to create shadows and depth, where the Spanish artists use what is called tenebrism. Tenebrism is this very inky black against an object that just really serves to highlight what we're looking at. So we will discuss this George Flegel a little bit later, but I do want to begin with the work of the great Albrecht Dürer. And you might look at this gouache and say, but wait a minute, that's Renaissance. That isn't a Dutch Baroque painting. But we always have to look at what predates the development of still lifes. So people like Albrecht Dürer were very scientifically minded. And remember, during the age of humanism and the Protestant Reformation, we begin to move away from highly religious subject matter, and we begin to look at more the everyday. And the Dutch were great at wanting to display the objects they collected, what their everyday life was like, and they would use them to decorate their homes. This drawing, because as I said, Dürer was a scientist, a writer, scientist in terms of his observations. He wrote books. He did multiple series. He was a printmaker. He traveled extensively in Italy. He worked with the Bellini brothers, Mantegna, Palaiuolo. I mean, he had a lot of interest in Italian work, and the Italians had a great deal of interest in him. So suffice to say, in the 17th century, we begin to see a lot of cross-pollination of North and South, meaning the Northern European artists to Italy, for example, and Spain, but primarily Italy. So in 1526, Dürer does this wonderful gouache, and it's hyper detailed. It's hyper real. This is called cow slips. Now, cow slips, actually, the real name is cow slop. And you might say, ooh, that's sort of a distasteful name. But they were often found in cow pastures. So perhaps what Dürer did is he either scooped this up and placed it in his studio and drew it, or he was able to sketch it on site. We're not quite sure. But suffice to say that in the Renaissance, artists are experimenting with the idea of still life, but it's really not until the 17th century that they get this really deep focus on still life painting. So we're going to talk first about an Italian painter, Caravaggio. Some people would say that Caravaggio was really the founder of the Baroque, or the father of the Baroque. And it's his dramatic use of light, his chiaroscuro, that is so influential to artists from the 17th century on. Artists like Rembrandt was very interested in the work of Caravaggio, just remarkable. So he lived in Rome. He had a sort of a troubled history, but he was brilliant. Many people said that he didn't even really sketch. He just started painting. And what we're looking at is his hyper-realistic kind of a Roman still life. He only signed 2 still life paintings that were strictly still life that we know of. And here we're looking at a wonderful sort of a memento mori and a still life, because why is it a memento mori? Look at this infiltration of insects. This is a basket of fruit in a beautifully hyper-real, tightly woven basket with fruit, a proliferation of fruit pouring out, but much of the fruit and the leaves are either desiccated or wormholed. And you can see here, the quince, of course, is unblemished on the surface, but then we have these leaves that are blighted. And we have an apple with a wormhole. And we have these bursting, desiccated grapes and these leaves that are folded over. What is he commenting on? What is his purpose? There could be a couple reasons. The memento mori, or the vanitas type painting, indicates that death and decay are inevitable. Perhaps that is what he's saying, but there's also another concept, and that is that he was a bit disgruntled by what was happening in the Catholic Church. And so he might have been commenting not only on decay and the cycle of life, but also about the church. So the second still life painting by Caravaggio is absolutely remarkable. And if you look at it and make a comparison, it's quite different. One is very fine line, tightly detailed, but here we have this gorgeous, sumptuous color. And we definitely see the use of chiaroscuro here. We have this shaft of light as it rains down on the melons, the zucchini, pears, quince, pomegranate, not plums, and grapes. And there was a story told that he actually cut a hole in the rooming house where he was living in Rome to gain a shaft of light to actually create this image. So the tonality is very warm and rich as the light falls on these objects. What is the meaning in this still life? It is probably not as moralizing as perhaps the other. It shows more of a sensuous nature. We've got these open fruit and this sort of sinewy, curvilinear forms here. And then we have this beautiful rough table. It's a stone table. It's not that refined Dutch stilleven where we have carpets and flowers and so forth. This is fruit and vegetables on a stone, which is beautifully rendered. So when we compare this to a Dutch or Flemish still life, we'll see quite a different style. And that's where we go to the work of the great Ambrosius Bosschaert. And he was considered probably pioneer of Dutch still life painting. He was interested in hyper detail. Now let's talk a little bit about the flower industry in the northern countries, particularly in Holland and Belgium, and very specifically in Holland. There was a great interest in flowers, particularly bulb flowers. And it's not just this whole idea of tulip mania, which we're going to talk about just in a second, but the fact that in Middelburg, Holland, there were beautiful gardens, botanical gardens. And there was a man named Carolus Claesz, and Carolus Claesz was a botanist, and he often encouraged artists to paint what were growing in these beautiful botanical gardens. And another thing that's very important to note is flowers in this carefully done arrangement would not all be blooming at the same time. What do I mean by that? Well, roses generally don't appear until spring or early summer. Tulips bloom at a different time. So these hyacinth and tulips, lilies of the valley, chrysanthemums, they were all found at different times, and most likely Bosschaert would sketch them and then assemble them in this tightly, beautiful, arranged still life. Now, like Caravaggio, he has this beautiful woven basket, which is a nice juxtaposition to these exquisite flowers. Look how wonderfully he details them. He loved to paint flowers. He did flowers, also some foodstuffs. He was a Protestant who was living, he was Flemish, but he was living in Antwerp. And what happened oftentimes is the Habsburg monarchy, because it was now controlled by the Catholics, many of the Protestant artists fled to Holland, to Middelburg, to Delft, etc. So it was Middelburg. He did work in Middelburg for a while. It was a very prosperous city. So it was not uncommon to have people wanting to commission these beautiful still life paintings. Remember, still life was meant to be put in smaller homes. We're not worried about palaces and castles as we had with the aristocracy. These are middle to upper middle class bourgeois people who loved having these wonderful still lifes to decorate their homes. So in the foreground, we have a carnation and a rose and a tulip. About 20 years after this painting was done, there was this thing called tulipomania. Tulipomania was such a quest to find the perfect tulip that the Dutch citizenry for a couple of years were really hurting their economic strength, because Holland at the time in the 17th century was a very strong economic powerhouse, strong navy, strong economy, wonderful artists, scientific discovery. So they had a very steady economy. But when people were bidding on tulip futures, really kind of the first stock market or a ventures market, they began to lose money. And so they had to outlaw that. But before tulipomania, 20 years before, tulips were so prized. They came from the steppes of Russia. They were brought into the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and then they made their way to Northern Europe. The word turban actually comes, a tulip comes from the word turban. So we look at this beautiful still life. We see the silky textures and the little bit of the modeling on the leaf, and he was very, very detailed. We have a dragonfly with its beautifully rendered wings, this exquisite butterfly. And what do they mean? Butterflies relate to transformation. And also insects sometimes deal with the ephemeral nature of life because they're fleeting. So this is a bit of a vanitas, but not overly so. We're going to go to the next artist, and that's Jan Bruegel the Elder. Jan Bruegel the Elder was a son of Pieter Bruegel the Elder. Now, if you visit our wonderful Timken Museum, you will see a work by his illustrious father. It's a still life parable, a landscape parable of the sower. But Jan Bruegel did not only do some religious paintings like his father, but he really concentrated on things like still life and landscapes. So he was considered a Flemish painter. Even though his father was born in Breda, which is on the Dutch-Flemish border, they practiced mostly in what would be today Belgium. His grandmother was a wonderful artist. His brothers, his father is a family, a dynasty. And they called him Velvet Bruegel. Why Velvet Bruegel? Because his masterful handling of the paintbrush. He also did some allegorical paintings and mythological paintings, so much so that the aristocracy, the kings and queens of Europe, loved his work. So he did train in Brussels with his grandmother, but spread out. His work was prized. He worked for he worked in Antwerp, but he also worked for some of the royal courts, and his work was highly, highly sought after. Now, this looks like a profuse collection of flowers, probably from a garden. It looks like they were just picked and placed in the baskets, very carefree and loosely placed. But again, these probably were not all picked at the same time, even though it appears that way. Look at the tulip with this variegated petals. Again, this is probably a blighted, a type of blight that actually created more beautiful tulips. And look at this very rare tulip. He's a masterful painter, detailed. The glassware, you can actually see shadows and light, chiaroscuro in this beautiful vase. So Velvet Bruegel, one of the greatest still life painters of the 17th century. Let me just go back. All right, Jacob van Es. And Jacob van Es was also from Antwerp, along with Osias Bert and Clara Peters. He worked in the medium of still life, but he did a lot of fruits and vegetables as opposed to flowers, not as much involved with flowers. Some of these seem like random objects, but they weren't. One thing I also want to point out is I am going to be talking about several women artists. I'm so proud to be able to do that because oftentimes in Western art, particularly before we get to the 17th century, we find almost all of the artists that we studied in graduate school, for example, were men. And we had fewer female artists, but we are going to look at quite a few female artists today. So this is a beautiful Juan Li bowl, probably from the Ming Dynasty. And if you look at the date 1630, you will note that you might note that before 1630, the objects selected for still life, stilleven, were often not as ornate or dramatic because it was after 1640 that more exploration, trade, and colonization was occurring. And so traders were bringing back beautiful objects that artists would see, collectors would love to showcase, because a lot of these still lifes not only were showcasing the botanical bounty of gardens, but they also wanted to showcase what they collected, whether it was timepieces or books or musical instruments or porcelain. They wanted to showcase what they had collected. So look at the three-dimensionality of this painting. He uses chiaroscuro very effectively to create depth. There is depth in a very shallow space, which shows the remarkable technique of Jacob van Es. He was known to be probably one of the greatest Flemish still life painters in the first generation. So you look at this Wanley bowl and look at the translucent grapes, exquisite as the light falls on them. And then we have some peaches open, and then these yellow plums. Do they have a symbolic reference? Because I told you in the beginning, symbolism is really important to these artists. Perhaps yes. Sometimes the yellow plums might relate to foolishness or sometimes fidelity. So that's not clear. Second of all, we have these red berries. And berries often relate to romantic love, sensuality. And because there's not any other overtly religious references, I'm going to go that this is more for the temporal world. It doesn't really discuss a more spiritual aspect. Now, this is what we would call a pronksstilleven, the ostentatious display of objects, probably done for a wealthy consumer. And Jan David Stijm from Antwerp was one of the greatest. He also worked between Holland and Belgium. So again, it's very hard to really say, do we call them just Flemish or do we call them Dutch? Because there's very many cross-pollinizations of these artists. But for discussion now, we will say that he did most of his work in the Flemish region. And actually, this painting was owned by Louis XIV. He loved the work of Jan David Stijm, and many of his works are in French collections. He did some vanitas. He liked to paint books. Now, we don't really see books in this painting, but let me explain what books and also musical instruments relate to. Books were sometimes considered by the Protestants, for example, that books and music to study and to spend so much time in the temporal realm of books might not always serve you when your time comes. I kind of disagree with that. I think the acquisition of knowledge is one of life's greatest pleasures, especially as we get older. But to suffice to say, sometimes people commented on that. But look at what he has one musical instrument here, but look at the glassware, the fruits, the tilted plates, very rakish angle, wouldn't you say? And then the exquisite folds of the cloth, this ewer beautifully done with gold and probably knotless shell. We have a parrot on top of a container. And then we have probably Mars. It looks like the god of war here. All kinds of manner of pie and fruit. and just exquisite. And then this sort of interior piece of furniture and a globe. So this is a very ornate expression of objects and collections, and much freer in the brushstrokes. If you look carefully, his brushstrokes are quite a little bit more gestural. And he did another one that's probably even more beautiful, and again, done around the same time. And this shows the bounty of the Dutch economy. What do I mean by that? Well, they were on the sea, the North Sea, and Antwerp and Amsterdam. And so they were bringing these crustaceans from the sea, the bounty. We have a nautilus shell. And the Dutch and Flemish really prize nautilus shells. They actually created drinking goblets from them. I will show you one a little bit later. I believe it's Willem that has the nautilus shell in one of his paintings. And then we have this sort of treasure chest, excuse me. What does it represent? Are we unleashing something? Is that a Pandora's box? Is it holding a treasure? And so there's a little bit of a mystery here. We also have lemons and citron, and those relate to, again, bringing objects from exotic locales. Silver, he masterfully uses light to highlight shadows and actually reflections in the silver. We have an oyster, which is connected to the sea, obviously, but also sensuality. Oysters represent sensuality. And then these translucent grapes. And then the strawberries were sort of an indication of your wealth too, because they were very expensive. But what's interesting too is this beautiful goblet and a roamer. Usually they'll have some kind of, roamer is a large drinking goblet with projections, because when you hold a drinking goblet, it's very hard, if it's smooth, to hold on to it. So this gives it a little opportunity to grasp it. But look how it teeters on the edge of this sumptuous still life. So Jan Davids to him. So I started thinking about Baroque still life when I saw the book by the great George Flegel. George Flegel was not known to me in graduate school. I was at a book sale at one of the museums, and I saw a book in German of Flegel's work, and I was mesmerized, just mesmerized. He was German, of course. He moved to Vienna for a while, also lived in Frankfurt. I believe he was born in what is called Moravia. He did train with a Flemish artist, Lucas van Wolkenposch. So he did have a connection to the other northern countries, but his was even more hyper-real and sometimes with religious overtones. So let's look at this magnificent still life with cherries. First of all, we have a goblet of wine, and then we have bread. And so that resembles the Eucharist. So that has a religious overtone. He probably also wanted to include the idea that we have these little berries, and these berries are actually not cranberries, but little currants. And the little currants relate to the Passion of Christ. And we also have these beautiful cherries. And what do the cherries relate to? Cherries relate to the Garden of Eden. So there was a religious overtone, and we have this wonderful slab of cheese. And what does that relate to? Cheese relates to longevity. So we have not only the idea of the Passion, the Eucharist, but the idea of longevity. However, with the dragonfly, we also understand that there's this comment on the brevity of life. So we have this idea of decay too, because there's a little bit of decay in the cheese. So, you know, this idea that life is brief, and also to have these sort of higher ideals that will carry with us in our passing. Now, let's look at this. I use this for, obviously, for to highlight the title of the painting. This is a remarkable work of art. I want to concentrate for a moment on the parrot. So the parrot, what does the parrot represent? You know, a lot of Dutch And Northern Baroque households did have parrots for pets. I'm not saying they all did, but many of them did. And since the Middle Ages, a parrot might represent the virgin birth of Christ, or it could be an eyewitness, the fall of man, or it could just be an everyday pet. We don't really know. And I actually do not believe that this is an overly religious or vanitas painting. There's really no other objects that were called memento mori, which I'm going to show you momentarily. He is a master. These are kind of random objects put at different eye level, which is a very skillful manner of handling these objects. We have a gorgeous embellished vase here with these little grotesques, silver, and we have a profusion of beautiful Flemish Dutch type flowers with a rare tulip, the parrot we talked about who balances on this stein, and then we have gorgeous depiction of Mars, again, god of war, this gold container. We have nuts and all kinds of fancy foodstuffs, figs. And again, these foodstuffs were not all grown in northern countries. This is a German artist. The grapes probably came from Spain, the citrus, again from Spain, quince and apple and melon, and it's all put into these beautiful levels to create a very nice visual display. You can even see the detail of lace on the tablecloth. His work was considered hyperreal. So that is the work of the great George Flegel. So we're going to talk about a very incredible artist, and that is Carl Fabritas. You might have read, I think her name was Donna Tartt. I did read this book called The Goldfinch, sort of about the mystery of this painting. So let's talk a little bit about Carl Fabritas. He was a Dutch painter. He worked in Amsterdam for a while with Rembrandt. He was probably Rembrandt's greatest student. Why do we say that? Probably because his work was so unique. He used the sort of soft gestural brushstrokes of Rembrandt, and he created his own kind of way, his own kind of manner of painting. He loved muted colors, soft light, and again, this very gestural style. Now, I want to show you, I'm going to go back just momentarily and compare. Look how hyper detailed, and of course, there's a plethora of objects, so it's kind of hard to compare, but let's look at the bird, for example. I am not saying one is greater than the other. It's just this is a different sensibility. This is hyper detailed. I mean, the eye even looks almost human. To this, where it's softer, more painterly, and again, as exquisite. So we have this little household pet. He stands on his little feeding box because he's chained, and he would be removed. They would take the food out of the little box and feed the bird. The tragedy of Carl Fabritas's life is this. He only worked for about 32 years. He was born in 1622 and he died the year of this painting. How did he die? Well, he was living in Delft at the time and he was prosperous. And what happened was there was a magazine explosion, a magazine being where they stored artillery and ammunition in Delft, and it blew up literally a third of the city. So many people died, including a student of his who was working with him. I said a third of the city, I apologize, a quarter of the city. So many people died, and people who worked in his little studio were killed. So it was a really, really deep tragedy. This is a masterpiece of what we call trompe l'oeil, fool the eye, because it really looks very three-dimensional. Another thing is, as Fabritas was a resident of Delft for a time, the great Johannes Vermeer was as well. And it's often been noted that Vermeer probably was influenced by him. And one other thing about Vermeer is look at the pristine lighting he uses and the wonderful, soft, muted textures and quality of the paint. So again, we're looking at the work of Carl Fabritas, and we will now move on. So I promised you that we would also look at some vanitas elements or memento mori as they were placed in flower arrangements. So Willem van Alst grew up in Delft, another Delft artist. He was a city notary. He also was known for many other, endeavors. I think he was a book collector. He did live in France for about 6-7 years and worked in Paris. And then he went to Italy. He then returned to Delft and later practiced in Amsterdam. He's very important not only for his skilled artwork, but he was a teacher of Rachel Rijs, the great woman artist, a later part of the Baroque. He also did a lot of hunting scenes, and he did other types of painting, but he was known for this exquisite still lifes. Again, look at the hyper detail. We have a dragonfly, a little mouse, and a stopwatch, or a pocket watch, sorry. Exquisite. You can even see some of the pollen on the flowers here. Well, what does the little mouse refer to? A mouse is something that is suspect to be prey for another animal. So it might indicate weakness. But why? Is it on this marble, beautifully rendered marble tabletop? We have a pocket watch with a ribbon, a beautiful blue ribbon. And again, these different flowers, it looks like chrysanthemums, rose, maybe tulip. I don't really see them. But so it shows how we can become powerless. It does show the passing of time and the ephemeral quality of a dragon wing. We also have a remarkable container for the flowers. I do flower arrangements as a hobby. It's a passion of mine. And I've often heard that the container is very important too. And the container here happens to be a nautilus shell, because as I mentioned earlier, nautilus shells were very prized. They came from the Pacific Ocean. They were brought in from exploration and trade. And so they were very much prized. So we have beautiful glassware. We have, a gold, the little mouse, and a hyper detailed, a lot of chiaroscuro as it falls on these flowers and twisted vines. So now I want to concentrate just for a little while on the idea of really strong vanitas paintings or memento mori. And we're going to look at the work of the great Pieter Claesz. This is in our very own Timken collection. It's one of my favorites. Right now, it is not on view because we have so many wonderful things going on at the Timken that we did have to move it for a short time. But suffice to say, it'll be back and you'll be able to see it. So this still life, we call it smoker's requisite and a breakfast scene. It was not uncommon for middle class objects to be detailed. It's not always these elaborate, ornate items that appeal to the still life artist. Pieter Claesz loved more monochromatic and a little bit less ostentatious objects, particularly in the time before 1640. From about 1625 to 1640, he was doing a little bit more muted palette, not overtly elaborate. And this is an example of this. So is it overly moralizing? Not really. Does it have objects of, these memento mori? Not exactly, but there is hints. So let's talk a little bit about Pieter Claesz. He was a Haarlem artist. He was a generation before the great Jacob van Ruysdael, he was a landscape painter, worked in Haarlem. And what's so nice is when you visit the Timken, when this is on exhibition, you will see these two Haarlem artists along with Frans Hals, who was also a great Haarlem artist, and they're all in the same room with some other masterpieces. But it's nice to know that these Haarlem artists are hyper recognized. So he was a meticulous painter. He also was influenced by Clara Peters and Osias Bert, and he loved to put tabletop images that were sort of cantilevered over this very basic kind of stone concrete table. Why does he cantilever the fish? Well, he wants to sell his paintings, and oftentimes if you can see the virtuosity of the artist by these cantilevered forms. Where is the moralizing? Okay, well, this Venetian glass, half empty. The brazier of waning ashes and fire, and then the dead fish. So he is moralizing. Life is ephemeral. Be careful, be temperate. And then these little pipes, and then tobacco would be stored here. What's also quite interesting about this earthenware beer container, you see the reflection here in the pewter, and there's reflections in the glass. And this, as I said, was Venetian because the Dutch were super great traders. Very masculine still life, I would say. But now we're going to see really what we would consider a vanitas painting with these memento mori. Look at this. Is there anything more indicative of the ephemeral nature of life than a skull? This hollow skull. Probably the most ubiquitous use of the skull is in the Dutch still life painting because it is a moralizing concept. We also have an overturned glass. What does that represent? Well, the overturned glass is the idea of temperance. Remember the Protestants, they were Reform Christians, and they believed in moderation. And so if you indulge too much, you will find things that break or topple. We also have the pocket watch, of course, that, again, that ephemeral nature of time, and this empty candlestick. It is burned down. He really uses a very monochromatic palette of browns and ochres, greens, a little bit of green, but he highlights this blue ribbon. It gives it a very quite interesting visual reminder, just this little bit of color. So an early still life before he started using more color and more of a profusion of objects. But this is a very stark, masculine still life. And again, those pages of the books. So you would think with the Dutch being a very learned culture, you know, developing science discovery, when you think about the von Leeuwenhoek, who lived in Delft on the same street as Vermeer, you know, they were very scientifically interested. But sometimes I thought if we spend too much time in cerebral endeavors, we might just sort of have our time pass too quickly. So that's the work of the great Pieter Claesz. Now we're going to go to the work of this wonderful woman artist. Sorry, let's make sure it goes to Clara Peters. Clara Peters lived a very long life. She was born in Antwerp. Her early work was very small scale, little detailed images, often representing food and beverages. And her skill is that she was trained by a master painter, Osias Bert. I didn't mention him. She liked groupings of valuable items, often portrayed gold and silver and things like that, exotic flowers. But here we have a really fascinating take on a still life, and it's still life with a cat and a fish. So what is represented here? Obviously, the bounty of the sea. These fish in this colander are just overlapping, this profusion. And look at this amazing light. She creates depth and shadow with this chiaroscuro, almost like tenebrism because of this inky black background. There's a bit of an overlap here. And she was one of the first female Flemish artists in the early part of the century. So she was an early woman artist. She's very naturalistic in her depictions. As I said, she could show texture. Look at the scales of the fish, the eyes of the cat as he claws into the fish. And look at the little crustaceans here, the sort of central oyster, the warm light as it bathes still life. It's very unique. Are there any moralizing aspects to it? Perhaps. Why? Well, it seems that the fish in the colander are almost like in a cross formation. That could be a stretch, but art historians have suggested that. The other thing is this fish head, like the snake in the garden. And lastly, fish, the disciples of Jesus were often fishermen. So that might be a reference, you know, his disciples fished, the head of the snake in the garden, the cross formation, all have sort of a religious, right here, I would say right here or here, probably here. I love the way, if you're a cat lover, I'm a dog lover, but cats in the family, and this pointed little ears as they go back and he clutches the fish. Well, for time's sake, we're going to move on to another female artist, and she's Italian, and her name is Giovanni Garzone. And Giovanni Garzone lived in the mid part of the 17th century. She died in 1670, so she had a pretty long life. One of the first Italian painters to practice still life. This is a very different kind of still life. It is more robust. Look at, she places these citron, which is a relative of the lemon. They have thicker peels. They're not as flavorful, but they're kind of unique in flavor, often used in cooking. We have these limes, I believe, and the flowers. She often placed an insect or some kind of unique object in the still life to divert our eyes. So we have like this little fly here, and then we have it placed on a very, very basic table top. I love these wooded leafy branches. She likes to contrast the very smooth surfaces of the fruit with these leaves. Now, she was very interested in botanical drawing. She often did work on vellum. She actually created books of botanical drawings. She was so well liked in Italy that they actually, she could command any price for her paintings. I love that. Brava, brava. She could command, anybody would buy her work. She was very well loved. And she did something very remarkable. At the end of her life, she left all her estate, her artwork, her monetary holdings to the Artists Guild in Rome. So that was quite remarkable. Remember, the Guild of St. Luke's was very popular, particularly in the north, for many of these artists. So her deep interest in science really helps to steer her depictions. So we'll go on to Wilhelm Kalf. So I mentioned that we didn't have, I'm sorry, I didn't include the work of Chardin, who was a genius of still life painting, who pretty much was a still life painter, but he really worked toward the very end of the Baroque, and so into the 18th century. So I decided not to include him. I could have done some work by the great Philippe de Champagne. We have a beautiful landscape by him in the Timken, but suffice to say, Kalf did have a presence in Paris for quite a while. He was born in Rotterdam, but he did travel. He was known to be a great still life painter. You can see some remarkable still lifes by Kalf actually in Russia. The Hermitage, he was very collected by the 19th century Russian robber barons, and so you can see some of his work there. This, of course, is in Madrid. His work really developed in a very ornate style. By the time we get to about 1650, this is done a little bit earlier, we have a porcelain embellished container with a silver spoon, and then we have a nautilus shell, hence the name. But the nautilus shell is kind of hard to see. It's probably right at the top, the base, and then we have probably Hercules holding up the nautilus shell, and we have this wonderful chiaroscuro with this porcelain painting and the citron. And again, this probably does not have a really moralizing message. It's more about the bounty and beauty of collected objects. So we just have a couple more I want to talk about. Here is another wonderful female painter, and this is the great Rachel Rijs. She was late Baroque. What was interesting about Rachel Rijs is her grandpa was a famous architect, and her father was an eminent scientist. So she worked in The Hague. She was Dutch, but also she did go to Dusseldorf for a while, but she lived a very long life, and her work was greatly prized. Because her father was a scientist, she really became interested in botanical drawings. This is beyond beautiful. Look how the chiaroscuro falls on the flowers, the petals, and this wonderful container. There's also some, we said that her grandfather was an architect, these wonderful architectural elements. You almost get a hint of a ledge here and some wall painting. It's dark, it's beautiful, and the fact that the light highlights the exquisite petals. This is not a moralizing still life. It is not really a vanitas. There's no memento mori here. What is she's doing is she's celebrating the bounty of the garden. Now, because we're kind of running out of time, I'm going to switch off to look at some of, hopefully, really quickly, one of my favorite artists, and I sort of discovered him too. Not I discovered him, but I, as a someone who's studying art, I didn't know much about Adrian Court's work. I looked at it, I was mesmerized. His is very unique. And again, not necessarily moralizing, more about the beauty and bounty. Now, we do see the use of tenebrism, where the light highlights, it's so stark, it really highlights the beauty of the form. So he worked in Amsterdam and, of course, Middelburg. And I mentioned Middelburg, which is about 2.5 hours outside of Amsterdam by train. Middelburg had beautiful gardens. I recall telling you about Carolus Clusius. And Carolus Clusius was someone who helped propel these still life artists to capture botanical drawings. So we have, this is a very, to me, very poetic. It's exquisite. It's sensitive. He literally places almost love and adoration on these very simple asparagus. It's a sharp contrast to the sumptuous stilleven by the Dutch and Flemish artists. His focus is on a refined rendering of these beautiful objects. And now, since I only have about 5 minutes, I might go over a minute or two. Please bear with me. I have to talk just a couple minutes about the great Spanish Baroque painters. Now, I told you that the Spanish Baroque painters were known for the bodegones, paintings. This isn't necessarily one. I will show you one in just a minute. So Francisco de Zurbaran was known for painting martyrs and nuns and monks for the monastic and church life. Primarily a religious painter. And he was called the Spanish Caravaggio because of his remarkable use of light. He did work in Sevilla for a while. He was appointed painter to Philip IV. And by 1640, he developed this incredible hard-edge, beautiful Caravaggio-inspired paintings. The problem with Zurbaran, unfortunately, was that Murillo, a contemporary of his, he was a successor to Juan Sanchez de Cotan, but Murillo, who we have a wonderful Murillo on the Timken, just exquisite crucifixion, but Murillo was a little softer and a little more, a sweeter religious painter. I don't know if that's the quite term. I don't mean to be too pejorative, but he was considered a little maudlin, not like Zurbaran. But Zurbaran loved still lifes. And actually, a very tragic story is that he had a son who was a remarkable still life painter, brilliant as his father, but he died young. So his body of work is pretty truncated. So we look at this still life with pots, and it's very systematically separated. It's aligned like on an altar. This looks like an altar. His intent was to be sort of the entrance to the temporal and spiritual realm. He's a very religious man. So we have the shadows that falls, this tenebrism. This is tenebrism at its finest. It just highlights, the light just highlights every aspect of these forms. They're pretty basic, except for this one, looks like it's pewter or silver. So because I only have 5, I'm going to go over just a minute or two. I apologize. I'm going to go on to one of the greatest still lifes ever created. If you ever hear any podcast by the great Pieter Sheldal, who wrote for the New Yorker, unfortunately he passed away not too long ago. He once wrote in the New Yorker that to him, and I have to agree, this is probably the most beautiful still life ever created. Still life with lemons, oranges, and a rose. And it is in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. I literally love this painting so much. I actually make a pilgrimage a couple times a year to actually feast on its beauty. So again, he was an artist from Sevilla. Look at the basket. It couldn't be more beautifully rendered. This is a very religious painting. Why? Well, the placement of the objects relates to the Holy Trinity. The rose without thorns relates to the Immaculate Birth. And also the symbolic purity of the Virgin. These lemons and oranges also relate to her purity and beauty and sacrifice. So this is, again, an altar designed as an altar, and we almost feel like we're entering a spiritual realm. I have a minute or two. I do want to remind us that this beautiful work is in the San Diego Museum of Art. This is a work by the great Juan Sanchez de Cotan. So Sanchez de Cotan was a little bit earlier than Zurbaran. He was a predecessor. He was a pioneer of realism. He did very austere still life paintings. He was born near Toledo, where the great El Greco lived, and was born. He was patronized by the aristocracy, very educated aristocracy. And how do we know that? Well, there's records, but also in this beautiful still life, we have a melon. And it relates to this idea of curvilinear forms, which was a mathematical concept called the, I can't remember the first part, but it's a hyperbola that talks about curvilinear forms in a mathematical way. We also have these hanging items. And I've told, if you listen to my lectures, I've said this many times, but in case you're new, I will say that I lived in a small town in the Mora in Spain when I was a young woman, and we didn't have refrigeration. We were told to tie up in the window seals our fruits and vegetables so they wouldn't rot. There was no refrigeration in this little early building that I lived in. By tying it up, they don't touch, and they often will last longer. Another thing, of course, he uses tenebrism, but he also is commenting perhaps on celestial interest, because it wasn't too long after this painting was done that Galileo turns his telescope to the heavens, 1609 to be exact. So suffice to say, 1608, sorry, suffice to say that they were looking and studying cerebral objects. And so that also could be, it sort of has that look of a solar system, as it were. And again, he's cantilevers on this very basic stone ledge. Juan Sanchez de Cotan became a lay member. He entered a Carthusian monastery, gave up sort of his sort of earthly realm, and became a lay priest. He was also a vegetarian, by the way, as the Carthusians were. So this also might be why these are vegetables and fruit. This is by Zurbaran, and I'm sorry, this is a magnificent Agnus Dei, that is the Lamb of God, and it really, I'm sorry I put it with Cotan's painting, that was my mistake. Look at, he represents the sacrifice of Jesus, and he lies supine here with his eyes half closed as he's dying, he's tightly held. But this is a very tragic still life. But I wanted to show you because it does relate to the religious quality of it, and also that objects is not always flowers and fruit. Lastly, I did want to just show you this one. This is Bartolomeo Bembi, and he lived just at the edge of the Baroque. But what I wanted to point out in this last comment is that the Medicis have these vast gardens. So he worked for the Florentine court, Bimbi, and he wanted to showcase the plethora of pears and fruits that the Medicis grew in their gardens. And so he's documenting it for them. And there's all manner of different kinds of pears. I won't go into the different varieties. I don't have time. But I wanted to end on this note and look at that beautiful dish. So I hope that you've got a little bit of a cross section of how still life varied and developed over about 100 years from the early part of the Baroque to this last painting from the edge of the Baroque. And see, I see we have our wonderful Renata. And Renata, do we have any questions?
Yes, we have two questions, and I'll start with the shorter one too, because the other one is a few questions. So Maria asked Karen, why do some of the artists work on copper?
That is such a good question, and I cannot answer that. I don't really know. I don't, there is an answer at this moment. I don't know. I can't even tell you. A lot of them worked on paper. That was really important, but copper, no, that's something I'm going to have to delve into. That's an excellent question, but thank you. No, I plead ignorance on that one. Sorry.
And the second question is a multi-parter from Ryan. He says, oh, Karen, who is your personal favorite still life painter after your research and favorite specific painting? Thanks always for your enthusiasm.
Oh my gosh, what a lovely question. Let me say this. I probably, in this group of paintings, I probably will go back to, go back to the beginning. Oh, so I lost my screen here. I will go back to the very beginning and I say probably two. I hope you don't mind if I pick two. This, it just mesmerizes me. There's something about the austere quality, the minimalist aspect of it, the light, the black and white, that dense tenebrism. Probably this is my favorite. And I'm very interested in the work of Adrienne Court. And I started really trying to explore. And I probably would, I love this lavish flagel. I just think it's so much fun. Just because it includes something that I'm passionate about, and that's flower arranging. So probably this one. And so these are my two favorites. And wow, there's just so many, so many. But in this talk, these are my two, Flegel and Court. But that's a great question.
He says, great, thank you. We have two other questions, one from Elliot Marshall. They are asking, define just what is still life, things that never move.
Yes, very good. Still even, things that don't move. But we have parrots, we have, the work by Carl Fabrides. So predominantly it is about objects that don't move, but with the hint of a bird, we bring in a little bit of animation there, but primarily it's to record objects with a symbolic meaning. So whether it's to showcase the collections of wealthy patrons, whether it's to show how the Dutch and Flemish imported all these wonderful objects from faraway places, maybe to show the moralizing characteristics. If we look back at, for example, wow, you can't get more moralizing than this, or still, as it were. But did I answer the question? Because it is really, that's a good comment, still even. Things that are set to be still. But then again, when you look at some of them too, there seems to be momentum. Like with this, actually feels like it has momentum, just the way that the objects are hanging, like you could just tap it. But primarily it's still, yes, still life. Are there any more questions?
Yes, and they keep coming.
I love questions.
So,
I love, and I'm sorry, I apologize to my viewers that I went over. It's really hard to condense 100 years sometimes in an hour, but I try.
We have two more as of right now. Judy asks, what is the list of names on the bottom of the last painting by Bambi?
Oh, those are different types of pear. I believe that these are the different species of pear, because if you look at around, they're all like, we have Bosch pear and we have, so these are probably documenting the varieties of the fruits, because they had vast, vast gardens, and they were very proud of the gardens. And so they really wanted to showcase what they were growing and their abundance of objects. So I believe that these were and I'm almost positive these were the different types of pear. Thank you, Judy.
And lastly, from Larissa, did Caravaggio use camera obscura? Thank you.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, because let me show you the painting and then we can talk about, that's a very good question, by the way, because we do think that Vermeer did use camera obscura. And if you read the book by David Hockney, the great British artist now living in America, he wrote a whole treatise on that. And if you see the film Tim's Vermeer, he tried to duplicate a Vermeer painting using camera obscura, and he was able to do it very well, considering he never painted anything in his life. Not that Vermeer wasn't a genius. That is not the case, but he probably did use some of these optical devices. Now, if you look at the work of Caravaggio, for example, there isn't that idea of super depth here. The other thing is it has been documented that he did not do elaborate sketches. He just started painting. Oftentimes, much of his work was just start to finish painting. So camera obscura, you really have to set up the optical devices, camera obscura, camera lucida. So you have to sort of set that up. And he probably didn't use it. I don't think he did. I would stick by that. But that's a very interesting question. Because they were used at this time, for example, but not Caravaggio. Some of the Dutch artists, yes, for sure. Well, I can't even say for sure because we don't really know. But there's very good chance that Vermeer did use them to some degree. And others, perhaps. I hope that answered the question. Any
Okay,
more?
these are the last two questions that we'll be accepting because we are going over time. But Elliot asks or comments, it was my understanding that defects in life appeared when the church relented imperfection in all religious painting. Agree?
I'm sorry, Renata, could you repeat that question?
Yes, it was my understanding that defects in life appeared when the church relented imperfection in all religious painting. Agree?
Gosh, that's a
I
complicated question, a little complicated. I'm not quite sure if I understand it correctly.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure if I can answer that. I mean,
Copy.
if I'm not quite sure what the are we referring to the Caravaggio? Because, if you this would be, looking at imperfections, but of course we're meant, there was imperfections in all religious, there's imperfections in all religious belief systems. And I think with the Dutch, this is a Catholic artist painting here. And so he was commenting on the Catholic Church. But the Dutch, the ones like Pieter Claesz, they were Protestant. Jan Bruegel could have been Protestant or Catholic because he painted both. But they do indicate with these moralizing ideas, these vanitas paintings, that we shouldn't be, it's more about our personal life of being moderate and temperate and reminding us of not being too, let's say, indulgent because it could affect what happens in the afterlife. But that's really all I can say about that. I do think that the imperfections in these churches, the new church of the Protestant Reformation, there were imperfections. And so perhaps some of these objects did, like, the little mouse in one of the Dutch or Flemish paintings, pray. What does that relate to? So there's a lot of subliminal messaging there too. So I don't think I answered. I kind of went around in circles. I'm sorry, but that's a pretty interesting. I'd have to really look at that question to think about it. And Renata, did you have one more?
Yes, so hopefully we went over. Did the people who commissioned still life display in their homes as a show to their guests how wealthy they are? From Facebook. This is from Facebook.
What a great, great question. You nailed it. Because, hey, how do you show? Look, I've collected Juan Lee porcelain. Oh, we have fruits from the sea, crustaceans. And we also went to Spain, or we got objects from Spain and the Far East and this globe. So they wanted to show off their wealth and collections. The Dutch were great collectors of objects and things. So yes, it was a kind of a show off sort of opportunity. And also really quickly, these were smaller, not always, but they were usually smaller paintings because, we're going away from the aristocratic high levels of wealth. It's more of bourgeois, the bourgeoisie. So they want, in the middle class, they want to decorate their homes with objects they love and collect to embellish the homes. And yes, they often definitely commission them for their homes and place them there. Good question, really good question.
Okay. Larissa says, thank you very much for the talk. And Ryan says, it's great to see so much participation. And hopefully it's a new trend for 2024. And I hope so as well. We always get very interesting conversations. But to end it here, thank you so much, Docent Helmerson, for such a fascinating and very engaging tour. At So we answered questions. And before you all go, I would like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our social media channel, Facebook. If you would like to find further information on any future tours being put on by the Timken Museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. Our next virtual talk is on February 8th on Zurbaran's portrayals of St. Francis. And we also want to let you all know that there's a new free ASL tour at the Timken Museum. Our next tour will be hosted on February 3rd at 11 a.m. So please spread the word and we hope to see you there. Thank you again for joining us this morning, and thank you, Docent Helmerson, for a wonderful presentation. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Thank you, Renata, very much.